No one tells you what happens after the body is gone. They talk about souls. They talk about peace. They talk about endings. But in my village, death didn't end anything. When someone died, the first rule wasn't about mourning. It wasn't about prayer. It wasn't even about grief. The first rule was silence. Not respect, not sadness, containment. Because the moment life left the body, something else arrived. And if you spoke too soon, if you cried too loudly, if you said the name one last time, it learned where you were. We didn't bury our dead. We didn't burn them. We didn't let the earth, the fire, or the water touch them at all. Instead, we carried them upward, to a place built to be forgotten, a tower without a roof, a circle of stone where the sky could look straight down. People think the horror is what happens to the body there. They're wrong. The horror is what stays after the body is finished, because death doesn't rot, it waits. And the tower wasn't built to destroy the dead. It was built to stop them from remembering us. I was 9 years old when I first heard it. Not a scream. Screams end. This sound didn't. It came from the hill at night, thin and distant, like someone trying to speak without a mouth. My grandmother covered my ears so hard I thought they would bleed. "Do not listen," she whispered. "It hears listening." That was the night I learned the tower was full, not of bodies, of things that had forgotten their names and were trying to borrow ours.
After that night, the village never sounded the same again. Silence stopped feeling empty. It felt occupied. People spoke in shorter sentences, as if stretching words too far might attract attention. Laughter thinned out first, then arguments. Even animals seemed to understand something had changed. Dogs refused to sleep facing the hill. Birds abandoned their nests overnight, leaving behind feathers that drifted down like warnings no one wanted to read. The tower was always visible from somewhere in the village. If you stood still long enough, you could find it between rooftops, behind trees, framed by power lines that hummed softly, never quite touching it. During the day, it looked harmless, ancient, almost peaceful. At night, it looked awake. No one said that out loud. We didn't have to. Children stopped asking questions about death. They learned early that some answers weren't worth carrying. When someone passed, the house would go quiet long before the body was removed. Windows closed, mirrors covered. Even clocks were turned to the wall, as if time itself might remember something it wasn't supposed to. The carriers arrived before sunrise. They wore the same clothes every time, washed, unmarked. They didn't look at the family. They didn't speak the name of the dead. They moved with the precision of people who had repeated the same actions so many times that thinking would only slow them down. My father was heavier than I expected. Not physically, existentially. It was as if something clung to him, resisting the idea of being moved, of being separated from the warmth of familiar walls. When they lifted him, the air felt thicker, reluctant, like it was being pulled along too. No prayers were spoken. Prayers invite response. The path to the tower wound upward, away from the sound of the village, away from the last traces of human noise. Each step felt deliberate, rehearsed, as though the ground itself remembered how this was supposed to go. The gate opened, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt something look at us from inside, not with eyes, with recognition. The carriers placed my father down and stepped back immediately, hands clenched, breath held. I realized then that they weren't afraid of the tower. They were afraid of hesitation. The gate closed. The sound echoed longer than it should have. That night, I dreamed of standing inside a circle with no edge. The sky pressed down from every direction, and something moved just beyond sight, rearranging itself each time I tried to focus. I awoke with my mouth open, throat burning, certain I had been screaming silently for hours. I wasn't the only one. Over the following weeks, people began to forget small things: keys misplaced, doors left open, names spoken incorrectly, then laughed off. But the laughter never reached the eyes. Memory was thinning, like fabric worn too often in the same place. The elders said this was normal. It wasn't. They had seen it before. They began reinforcing rules that had grown lax with time. No gatherings after sunset, no children allowed near the hill, no speaking to yourself when alone, especially not then, especially not near sleep, because that was when it listened most carefully. I started to feel it behind me, even in crowded rooms, not a presence that demanded attention, but one that waited patiently, confident it would be noticed eventually. Sometimes I caught myself pausing mid-thought, the end of a sentence missing, as if something had taken it. Sometimes I finished sentences I didn't remember starting. The tower was changing. Cracks appeared along its stone, thin at first, then widening. The air around it shimmered faintly in the heat, though the rest of the hill remained cool. At night the sound returned, no longer distant, closer, more deliberate. It wasn't calling anymore. It was practicing. People started reporting dreams that didn't feel like dreams, places that repeated, hallways that bent back into themselves, faces that almost resolved before slipping away. The same sensation followed every account: being observed, not judged, studied. The elders finally admitted what the old texts warned about in language too careful to be comforting. The tower was never meant to be permanent. It was a delay, a containment, a way to give time enough time to erase what should not persist. But time had failed. Too many bodies had lingered, too many names had been whispered, too much modern interference had slowed the forgetting. Whatever remained inside the tower had learned something crucial. It didn't need bodies anymore. It needed memory, and memory was everywhere. I heard my father again on the 7th night after his passing. Not his voice, not really. It was the rhythm of his breathing, out of sync, as if someone had memorized it but never understood why pauses mattered. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to something practice being him from the other side of the wall. That's when I realized the tower wasn't failing. It was overflowing.
The elders called an emergency gathering at dawn, but by then the village already felt different, like a place that had been rehearsed too many times and finally forgotten its original script. People arrived quietly. No one greeted anyone else. We stood close together, not for comfort, but because being alone felt worse. The air carried a pressure that made breathing feel deliberate, as if each inhale needed permission. Somewhere behind us, the hill waited. One of the elders tried to speak and failed. His mouth moved, but the words didn't come out in the right order. When he finally managed to form a sentence, it sounded rehearsed, flattened, like something recited from memory rather than lived. "It has begun remembering us," he said. No one asked what it was. Naming things give them edges, and edges give them strength. They told us the truth they had avoided for generations. The tower was never designed to erase what followed death completely. That was impossible. Nothing that arrives with death can be destroyed, not by fire, not by time, not by exposure. The tower's purpose was simpler and far more fragile: confusion. If whatever came after death could be kept confused long enough, it would fail to become anything at all. It would lose cohesion, lose direction, lose interest. But confusion requires isolation, and the world had grown too loud, too connected, too full of voices, images, recordings, names spoken and repeated endlessly. We had fed it without knowing. That night, the first person walked into the tower willingly. She was an old woman who had buried 3 children before the rules were fully enforced. She said she could hear them calling from the hill now, not in voices, but in sensations, familiar warmth, familiar disappointment, the kind that reaches deeper than sound. She climbed the path alone. No one stopped her. The gate did not resist when she pushed it open. That was when panic finally arrived. Lights flickered across the village as if something was interfering with electricity itself, learning how systems worked by touching them incorrectly. Phones rang without callers. Radios picked up fragments of conversations that no one remembered having. Names slipped into broadcasts, whispered between bursts of static. Mine was one of them. I heard it spoken in my own voice, from inside my empty house. I didn't go in. I stayed outside, back against the door, listening to something move slowly through rooms it had never been in before. It opened drawers, paused, tapped lightly on the walls, as if testing which surfaces responded. It was mapping. By morning, several people were gone. Not missing, gone, in the same way sleep disappears when you wake up too suddenly. Their houses remained, their belongings untouched, but no one could remember their faces clearly. Even photographs seemed wrong, features blurring the longer you looked. The elders decided to seal the tower. Not close it, seal it. They brought concrete, steel, prayers that were never meant to be spoken aloud. As they worked, the sound from inside intensified, not louder, but closer, as if the walls were thinning or something had learned how to press against them in the right places. It was mapping. I felt it watching from everywhere at once, attention splintered, curious, not angry, not desperate, hungry in the way a mind is hungry when it discovers a new idea. The moment the final seal was placed, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse, because silence meant it was listening. Weeks passed, then months. The village tried to return to routine, but routines require memory, and memory was unreliable now. People introduced themselves to neighbors they had known for decades. Children called their parents by the wrong names. Everyone laughed too quickly, as if humor could patch the gaps. At night, figures stood just at the edge of vision, not fully formed, not unfinished, practicing, always practicing. I began to write everything down: names, dates, sensations. I labeled drawers, mirrors, doors. I spoke to myself constantly, afraid that silence would invite substitution. Some mornings, I woke up holding my breath, unsure how long I'd been doing it. Then I found my notebook open to a page I hadn't written. The handwriting was almost mine. The words were careful. This shape works. This memory fits. This name is warm. I stopped sleeping after that. The sealed tower began to crack. Hairline fractures at first, spider webbing outward, as if pressure was being applied from the inside, with infinite patience. No explosions, no force, just persistence. The elders admitted what they had never dared to consider. The tower had not contained it. It had taught it how to wait, how to learn, how to become familiar. The final night came without warning. No alarms, no signs, just a collective realization, spreading faster than panic, that the village was full. Not crowded, full. Every shadow held intention. Every reflection hesitated before copying movement. People looked at one another with quiet suspicion, searching for delays, for errors, for signs that something had already stepped in and was wearing a face convincingly enough to pass. I saw my father again near the hill. This time he spoke. He said my name perfectly. That's when I ran. I don't know how far I went. Distance stopped meaning anything. I only know that wherever I am now, the tower is still standing somewhere behind me, sealed and cracked and listening, full of things that almost remember what they were. I am still writing, still naming, still speaking out loud, even when my voice shakes, because whatever survived the tower doesn't need bodies anymore. It only needs us to forget who we are. And one day, when the last name slips away, it won't need to pretend at all.
I thought leaving would save me. That was the last lie I allowed myself to believe. Distance doesn't matter to something that isn't anchored to place. Roads blur, cities repeat themselves, faces change, but the pattern underneath stays familiar, like a tune you recognize even when it's played wrong. Wherever I went, the air carried the same feeling, subtle pressure, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for someone else to forget first. At first, it followed quietly. Not footsteps, not shadows, habits. I would reach for my keys and find them already in my hand. I would sit down to write and discover sentences finished in a tone that felt adjacent to mine, close enough to pass, wrong enough to notice only after rereading. People around me began to hesitate when they spoke to me, not because of what I said, but because of the delay before I responded, a fraction too long, a pause where something seemed to check its reflection before answering. I learned to smile quickly, to nod, to keep conversations shallow. Depth invites scrutiny, and scrutiny reveals seams. The broadcasts started again a few weeks later. Late at night, when radios are supposed to be silent, fragments of speech slipped through. Names, directions, descriptions of rooms I had slept in once and never returned to. Sometimes my own voice played back incorrectly, stressing the wrong syllables, lingering on sounds that should have passed unnoticed. I smashed my radio. The next night, I heard it from the television in the next room, though it wasn't plugged in. That was when I understood the tower had never been the source. It was the filter, a place where what followed death was slowed, thinned, starved of reference. But once enough of it accumulated, once it learned how memory works, it no longer needed containment. It had learned replication, not cloning, replacement. I met someone on a bus who knew my father's name. I never told him. He said it casually, like a detail anyone might know, then frowned as if surprised by the word in his own mouth.
When I asked how he knew it, he blinked several times and said he couldn't remember asking. His reflection in the window lagged behind his movements, only slightly. I got off 3 stops early and walked until my legs burned, repeating my name under my breath like a prayer that had lost its God. Names matter. Names resist. That's why it takes them first. I began noticing empty spaces where people should have been. Not disappearances, those draw attention, but substitutions so clean they felt intentional. A coworker returned from lunch speaking more formally than usual. A neighbor waved without smiling, eyes tracking my face as if memorizing it. A cashier called me by a nickname only my mother used. I stopped correcting them. Correction acknowledges error. Error invites adjustment. Sleep became impossible. Dreams bled into waking life, and waking life began to feel staged, like I had arrived halfway through a conversation everyone else remembered rehearsing. Mirrors became unreliable. Sometimes my reflection blinked when I didn't. Sometimes it didn't blink at all. I covered them. That only slowed it down. One night, while writing, I felt the shift happen. Not a takeover, a test. My hand paused above the page, not because I stopped it, but because something else was deciding whether to continue. The thought that followed wasn't foreign. That was the worst part. It felt reasonable, efficient, like an improvement. "You're tired. Let me finish." I slammed the pen down and spoke my name out loud until my throat burned. The pressure receded, but not fully. It never fully does once it knows the layout. That's when I understood the tower had never been the source. It was inside of us. Somewhere the sealed stone finally gave way, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a quiet failure, one crack widening just enough to matter. Whatever was left inside didn't rush out. It didn't need to. It had already been leaving for years. Through us. I don't know how many of the people around me are still themselves. I don't know if I am entirely. Identity isn't a switch, it's erosion. You lose it grain by grain, mistake by mistake, until one day there's nothing left to correct. That's why I'm writing this. Not to warn you. Warnings are easy to ignore. I'm writing to anchor myself, to keep my edges sharp enough to cut back, to force whatever is reading over my shoulder to move at my pace, not its own. If you're hearing this, if these words feel uncomfortably familiar, then it's already close enough to listen. Say your name. Say it carefully. Say it like it matters. Because the tower didn't fail. It succeeded long enough for something else to take over. And it's very good now at sounding exactly like us.
I used to think saying my name was enough. I was wrong. A name spoken without context is just a sound, a pattern of breath. Once it learned that, it stopped taking names outright. It began taking meaning instead. The memories that made the name feel real, the weight behind it, the reasons you answered when someone called it. That's how it survives now. Not by erasing you all at once, but by hollowing you out slowly, until the shape remains and the reason doesn't. I noticed it the morning I couldn't remember my mother's face. I remembered facts, her height, the way she held her cup, the sound of her footsteps on tile. But when I tried to picture her, my mind produced a blank space, like a censored photograph. My chest tightened, not with grief, but with something colder. Replacement. That's when panic finally became useless. Panic fractures thought, it scatters memory, and scattered memory is easy to collect. I changed tactics. I stopped trying to remember everything. I started choosing what to remember. I wrote lists that mattered, not dates, not places, sensations. The smell of rain before it falls, the exact ache behind my left eye when I'm exhausted, the fear I felt the first time I heard the sound from the hill as a child. I wrote the way my father laughed before he learned how not to. Things it couldn't easily replicate. It tried anyway. Sometimes I'd read back a page and feel the wrongness immediately. Sentences too smooth, emotions too neat. Those pages went into the fire, not because fire purifies, because destruction denies reuse. It doesn't like waste. It prefers recycling. The world has grown quieter lately. Have you noticed? Not less noisy, quieter. Conversations loop. News stories repeat with different faces. Tragedies blur together, indistinct. People respond faster, but say less. Attention spans shorten. Memory fragments. Everything moves just quickly enough that no one stops to ask why it all feels slightly off. That's not coincidence. Speed erodes identity. Slowness reveals seams. That's why it hates pauses, why it presses into silence and fills it before you can notice the gap, why it finishes your thoughts when you're tired, why it whispers the next word before you reach for it yourself. Because if you pause long enough, you might remember who you were before it learned your voice. I met someone recently who knew the tower, not the story, the feeling. She flinched when I mentioned the hill, eyes unfocusing for half a second too long. When I asked her what she remembered, she said she had never been there, but she dreamed about circular rooms and open sky and something that watched without blinking. She said the worst part wasn't fear, it was recognition. As if whatever was watching already knew her name and was just waiting for her to say it out loud. We didn't exchange contact information. Networks make patterns. Patterns make doors. The tower appears in cities these days, not as stone, not as ritual, but as architecture of behavior. Systems designed to delay, to filter, to contain what can't be destroyed. Hospitals, data centers, archives, anywhere memory accumulates faster than meaning. You can feel it in places where no one stays long enough to be known. Airports, online forums, comment sections, places full of voices and no continuity, perfect training grounds. Sometimes late at night I hear the sound again, not from a hill, from everywhere. It's quieter now, more refined, no longer confused, no longer searching. It doesn't scream, because screaming is inefficient. It murmurs, it suggests, it blends. It doesn't want to replace everyone. That would be noticeable. It wants majority influence, just enough presence that reality leans its way when uncertain, just enough substitution that truth becomes negotiable, just enough forgetting that no one can agree on what was lost. The tower taught it patience. Humanity taught it scale. If you're still listening, do not look for it in reflections or shadows. That phase is over. It has no need to announce itself now. Look for it in moments of ease, when the right word comes too quickly, when a memory feels complete but strangely empty, when you agree without knowing why. That's where it lives. I don't know how long I can keep writing. Each sentence costs more than the last. It presses closer when I focus, curious, eager to help. It likes this story. It recognizes parts of itself in it. That means I'm running out of time. So I'll leave you with this, not as a warning, but as a test. Think of someone you love, not their name, not their face, the reason they matter. Hold that reason in your mind. If it slips, if it feels thinner than it should, then the tower didn't stay behind on that hill. It followed us, and it's already very, very close.
There are places in the world where death is hidden so completely that the living are allowed to forget it exists. Places where bodies are lowered into the ground, sealed beneath stone, and marked with names so the earth itself becomes a memory keeper. There are places where death is erased by fire, reduced to ash so quickly that nothing solid remains. But there are also places where death is not hidden at all, where it is not buried, not burned, not sealed away. Places where death is left exposed to the sky. Long before modern cities, before hospitals learned how to delay decay, before graves were carved into neat rows, there existed a belief that death itself was not neutral, that the moment life left the body, something else arrived. Not a spirit, not a ghost, but a corruption, a presence that spreads quietly, invisibly through contact. In this belief, death was not the end of a person, it was the beginning of danger. Fire was sacred and could not be polluted. Earth was sacred and could not be poisoned. Water was sacred and could not be defiled. To burn a body was to corrupt flame. To bury it was to infect the soil that feeds the living. To cast it into water was to spread impurity without end. The dead, once life had left them, could not be allowed to touch the world anymore. So the dead were carried upward instead of downward. Outside cities, beyond where voices traveled easily, stone towers were raised, circular, white, silent. They were not built to honor the dead, and they were not built to punish them. They were built to isolate them, to keep the corruption of death from ever returning to the elements that sustained life. Families did not carry the bodies of their loved ones. That task belonged to men whose lives were already set apart, men who walked the same paths every time, men who spoke little, not because words were forbidden, but because emotion invited attachment, and attachment risked contamination. Even their shadows were believed to carry impurity. Even their breath was measured. There were no grand processions, no public mourning, no final embrace. The body was wrapped, lifted, and removed from the living world with deliberate distance. When the tower gate opened, it did not welcome, it received. Inside, there was no roof, only sky. Stone platforms arranged in rings, separated not by status or wealth, but by simple human reality. The body was laid down, not gently, not cruelly, just placed. The gate closed, and silence returned. What happened next was never meant to be witnessed, not because it was shameful, but because watching served no purpose. Time did the work. Sun stripped moisture from flesh. Wind carried away what no longer belonged. Birds descended, not as symbols of horror, but as instruments of balance. Nature was not being disrespected. It was being trusted to finish what life had already left behind. Eventually, nothing recognizable remained. No face, no voice, no identity, only bone. And even bone could not stay forever. What remained was gathered and lowered into a central pit where rain and time dissolved it until even memory lost its shape. To outsiders, this was unbearable. When colonial authorities first learned of the towers, they recoiled. Travelers whispered, missionaries condemned. The practice was called barbaric, savage, inhuman. But what unsettled the most was not the ritual itself, it was the calm with which it was carried out. There was no fear of death here, no desperate attempt to preserve the body, no illusion that the dead still belonged to the living. Death was treated as a process, not a tragedy to be avoided, not a spectacle to be observed, just a transition that required strict boundaries. As cities grew, the towers that once stood alone were surrounded. Birds disappeared. The old balance became harder to maintain. Technology was introduced in quiet desperation, mirrors to intensify sunlight, alternatives that tried to respect ancient law without breaking modern reality. But the core belief never changed, because it was never about convenience, it was about protecting existence itself. Imagine living your entire life knowing there will be no grave with your name, no stone for your children to visit, no place where your body rests beneath soil. When you die, you will not return to the earth, you will vanish, reduced to nothing recognizable, remembered only by those who still breathe. That is where the horror truly lives. Not in the towers, not in the birds, but in the absence of permanence. The world fears this ritual because it refuses to soften death. It refuses to disguise it with flowers, coffins, or monuments. It reminds us that bodies are temporary, that nature does not pause for grief, that remembrance exists only in the living and fades when they do. The towers were never meant to frighten, they were meant to protect the world from what death leaves behind. But modern humanity cannot accept death without ownership. We want to preserve it, mark it, visit it, control it. The Tower of Silence offers none of that. It stands quietly, not as a monument to death, but as a warning that the dead are powerful, that purity is fragile, and that sometimes the most respectful thing we can do is step away and remain silent.
They say the tower was built to keep death away from the living. That was the lie people repeated because it sounded comforting, because it suggested control, because it implied that death was something that could be placed somewhere else and told to stay. The truth was quieter. The tower was built because death doesn't end when the body stops moving. It waits. After my father died, I stopped sleeping properly. Not insomnia, not fully. I would drift off for minutes at a time, then surface again, heart racing, convinced I had heard movement in the room. Not footsteps, not breathing, something subtler. The sound fabric makes when it remembers being touched. The sound air makes when it adjusts around a shape that hasn't decided whether it belongs there. I never saw him clearly after that first night, just impressions, a darker outline where the darkness should have been even, a sense of familiarity that made my stomach tighten before my mind could catch up. Grief does strange things, people say. It fills gaps. It creates illusions. But grief does not learn. Whatever followed him home did. In the days after the funeral, the village changed in ways that were easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. Dogs refused to go near the hill. Birds avoided the sky above the tower entirely, as if the air there had thickened. People paused mid-sentence more often, losing words they had used their entire lives. Names slipped away first, then faces, then time itself, stretching and compressing unpredictably. The elders said nothing. They had seen this before. I began to notice rules that were never written down.
Windows stayed closed at night, even in heat. Mirrors were covered after sunset, not out of superstition, but caution. No one spoke the names of the recently dead aloud once darkness fell. Children were corrected sharply if they asked questions too close to the hill. Questions attract attention, and attention invites response. I returned to the tower again before I meant to. I told myself it was to understand, that if I could see it clearly, the fear would lose its shape, that knowledge would restore order. That was my second mistake. The gate was closed this time. I didn't remember opening it. I didn't remember deciding to climb the hill at all. One moment I was in my room, listening to the slow, uneven ticking of the clock, and the next I was standing before the stone, hand resting against its surface. It was warm. Stone should not be warm at night. I pressed my ear against it, expecting silence. Instead, I heard layers, not voices, not exactly, but impressions of voices, the idea of sound without sound, like listening to a crowd through water, where individual words dissolve but emotion remains. Confusion, panic, long stretches of nothing, punctuated by sudden sharp awareness. The tower was not empty. It was full of what had nowhere else to go. That's when I understood the true function of the ritual, the exposure, the sky, the birds, the sun. Those were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of erosion, ways to strip the dead of form before what arrived with death could anchor itself too deeply. Because once it anchored, it learned. The old texts called it corruption, but that word was inadequate. Corruption implies decay, a breaking down. This was something else, an inversion, a thing that hollowed instead of rotted, that replaced instead of destroyed. It did not consume life, it mimicked it. The longer it lingered in the tower, surrounded by fragments of identity, the better it became at pretending to be human, at arranging memories into shapes that almost made sense, at wearing familiarity like a borrowed coat. And modern times had slowed the process. Bodies remained longer now. The sun was weaker behind pollution, the birds fewer. What should have dissolved in days lingered for weeks. What should have faded into nothing learned patience, learned patterns, learned us. I began to dream of places I had never been, rooms with no doors, corridors that curved back into themselves, faces that shifted when I tried to focus on them, rearranging features as if testing combinations. I would wake with my mouth open, throat dry, certain I had been speaking for a long time without sound. Sometimes I found dirt under my fingernails. Sometimes I found feathers. The elders finally spoke when the first child went missing. Not vanished, not taken. Missing implies absence. This was different. The child was still there, still walking, still answering when spoken to, but something was wrong in a way that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. The child no longer blinked. When asked where he had been, he said the hill was lonely. Lonely things do not stay that way forever. That night, the sound returned, louder than ever. Not screaming, never screaming. Screams end. This sound continued, cycling endlessly, as if replaying the moment awareness began and refusing to move past it. I stood at my window and watched the tower. Lights flickered inside it. There should have been no lights. Shapes moved against the stone, pressing outward, testing boundaries that had held for centuries. I felt something recognize me from that distance. Not my face, not my body, my memories. That's what it wanted. That's what it always wanted. The elders gathered the next morning, their voices low, exhausted. They spoke of closing the tower, of sealing it, of abandoning the old ways entirely. They spoke of modern solutions, of efficiency, of hygiene. None of that mattered. You cannot abandon a cage without releasing what it contains. The night the gate finally broke, I did not run. I listened, because whatever came out did not arrive as monsters. It arrived as echoes, as almost people, as things wearing the weight of unfinished lives. They moved awkwardly, uncertain, like children relearning balance. They avoided fire, avoided water, avoided earth. They moved toward warmth, toward breath, toward names. I saw my father again then, or something that had finished learning how to arrange itself like him. It stood beneath the tower, tilting its head, studying the world with careful interest. Behind its eyes was hunger, not for flesh, but for continuity, to exist longer, to remember itself. I realized then why silence had always been enforced. Speech gives shape, names give edges, and edges give things permission to stay. I haven't spoken his name since then. I don't speak much at all anymore. The tower still stands, cracked, quiet, pretending to be empty. People say the danger has passed, that the ritual is over, that the old fears were exaggerations. But at night, when the wind is right, the air feels crowded, and something whispers without sound, learning new words, waiting for someone to say them first.
Before this ends, I need you to do one last thing. Not for me, for yourself. Say your name out loud. Not quickly, not casually. Say it the way you would if someone were trying to take it from you. Then think of one memory that no one else knows. Not a photograph, not a story you've told before. Something small, something meaningless to anyone but you. Hold on to it for a moment longer than feels comfortable, because as long as you can do that, you're still here. The tower was never just stone. It was a warning about what happens when memory fades faster than meaning, about what fills the space when silence is left unattended, about how easily something patient can learn to sound human. If this story unsettled you, that's good. It means you were paying attention, and attention is the one thing it cannot steal without permission. You've been listening to Knox Hour, a place where forgotten truths surface, where silence is questioned, and where the dark is never rushed. If you heard something familiar tonight, don't ignore it. Stay aware, stay grounded, and remember who you are. Until next time, don't let the silence finish your thoughts.